excited to be here. Wanted to go to an IDA event forever, and it's always just never quite coalesced. So thank you, IDA Hub, for making this possible. This is talk about the sort of the digital art scene, the maybe even the wider art scene through the lens of an ecosystem or a superorganism. Um, as Leah mentioned, I was approached. I work for I'm on the board of Collusion, and they were looking at how they position themselves in an increasingly difficult landscape. And so we spoke about the possibility of them potentially pursuing a charitable position, an increasingly charitable position, or a commercial one. And it feels like we're full of kind of binaries in all the arts landscape. Either we need to be extremely funded and subsidized charitable, or we need to be hell for leather commercial and just make as much money as we possibly can. As it is, it's always more complicated than that, I suppose. And so this talk was presented in February to look at what the ecosystem potentially looks like from like a bee's eye view. If you were navigating this space, what are the patterns? What are the pressure points? Um, what's coming up for people who are on the ground essentially. And so I was speaking with artists, and the first person that I spoke with perfectly summarized the entire thing. It's not just solo artists, it's the whole system. And so we'll move through sort of our current reality where resources are scarce, there's extraordinary talent, there's a huge amount of demand for the work. Um, but the landscape is increasingly difficult to navigate. If you're talking, this is going to be an overly stretched metaphor all the way throughout, guys. But if you're talking about bees, the increase in chemicals and pesticides and neonicotinoids make the bees' life so much harder, right? Like one of the things that was amazing to me going through the February event was that it is a dialogue, and that while we can't sort of escape some of these cycles because they are, the air we breathe, um, that we can at least acknowledge how tricky things are. And so, this idea of a system under sustained pressure, how do we adapt? So to look at this, I kind of wanted to balance another binary, a sense of you have artists on the one side and then you have institutions on the other. I sort of felt it was increasingly like a yin yang, one wants a tiny bit of each one in each, and um, we want to try and find balance in some way. It can feel adversarial within that context, artist directors who are like, I'm out of money, don't approach me, I can't just commission you, no, I've got too much going on. And then artists who need to kind of meet the needs of increasingly stretched organizations and institutions by kind of bending themselves into every available possible shape. One programmer said it's not a lack of will, it's a lack of capacity. And so, to what extent are artists needing to sort of inflate and fill that capacity that venues are no longer sort of able to provide? So, to do that, I sent out a couple of surveys, and a whole bunch of people replied on each side. The questions were largely the same. Um, and it was about having an open conversation. I then also conducted around 10 or 15 in-depth interviews, which gave me a lot of the quotes that then populate this talk, and informed a lot of my thinking on how to structure my presentation of the things that I was finding. What I was finding was that we are all adapting to meet the increasingly stretched need. Um, and a lot of those adaptations are coming from risk. So, this kind of perfect quote here, I'd like to take the risk, but I'm going to program the other thing. That came directly from an artistic director who was talking about a VR experience, in the sense of, I'm so interested in it. It was clearly a wonderful work of art. The artist values align with our own, but the audience size is smaller. And so I really need to bear that in mind whilst I program my festival essentially. So this one is from one of the producers who attended the February event. You either have the money to do it or you have nothing to lose, so you try anyway. And again, it feels like there's kind of this, it's all or nothing at all times. So whilst this isn't a manifesto, it's an attempt to kind of try and find a middle way. So, like I say, we're all adapting, and one of the things that we're finding as I'm talking with producers, artists on the ground, is that there's an increased need to hybridize the way that we work. So, Dev Joshi, who is of Relative Distance, one company that makes high-end art products that are technically integrated, and Whatever Together, which is more of a group collective studio that responds to briefs, said a wonderful thing. The word immersive got commodified. Now there's an expectation of heroics that someone will fix it. I worked for Punchdrunk for many years, and one of the many things that feels like an unwritten rule of immersive works is that we will need to massively over deliver in some way. And that means that if expectations kind of get misaligned, we can end up staying up all night, doing a huge amount of hidden work, doing our own, I don't know, marketing in smaller projects, or doing our own, running a lot of unseen systems that aren't necessarily valued or paid for. There was also an acknowledgement of the time changing. It'll never be the magic window between 2012 and 2017 again. That's perhaps less useful in the sense of, 2012 to 2017 potentially doesn't mean anything to people who are emerging as an artist in 2019, 2022. A lot of time has passed since then. But there was an acknowledgement from this artist's perspective that the need to hybridize, the need to kind of take commercial work as well as consider funding as a potential route to ideation, R&D, developing works, is the only way to really stay afloat. There's an acknowledgement in the current landscape that we might be good at R&D, but that there is kind of a sense of a distribution cliff, a moment where R&D, which is it's possible to get some funding. Even if we're making it ourselves, even if we're doing it on our own time, at the point that we're at R&D, we're not carrying as much risk as individual artists. But the point at which we want to come into production, touring, scaling, versioning, etc., we are going to need some kind of support. And if we don't have an angel investor, then how are we going to do it? When you then get to the point of distribution, and I might go into this later, but beyond that, sort of an afterlife, there's almost no support really. So that sense of exposure being why something's worth it, that sense of again the artist needing to come up to meet the need of a stretched organization. And a lovely quote here from Sherry Dobbin: "We're missing the bridge between MVP and scale." Another phenomenon that kind of is leading to this need to hybridize, but is potentially exacerbated by it, is this notion that failure increasingly isn't an option. This kind of little beginning of the doom loop, as I perhaps said, these two questions: what are the challenges artists are facing, and how do we escape the doom loop of some of these challenges? You can kind of see a little bit here how it begins to play out. So if innovation requires failure, which we think we know, that's semi-axiomatic, we will need to make mistakes in order to get to the place we want to go to. Then let there be funding available. And as I say, R&D has some funding available. But that because we increasingly have accountability attached to that funding, perhaps other, and maybe these are access barriers we can look at, that accountability can potentially wear down the possibility of failure. And so what else is going on? This another one of these binaries that's sort of showing up is the one between honesty and survival. So you have again this idea of art for art's sake versus the extremely commercial. And as you kind of hold that in mind, you think, well, yeah, heroics is a completely rational response to the notion that the show must go on. There was a lot of kind of requests from the programming side for artists to be kind of brutally honest about their capacity. This sense that artists have to break themselves, that people are burning out, that capacity gets overloaded at some point. And so, yeah, there's something emerging here about sort of messy creative arts practice versus kind of agile innovation pathways and sprints. And so, yeah, just another phenomenon to remark on. Another point of tension, idealism versus reality. And so this is where money really comes into it. My colleague Malu Ansaldo is really excellent in this regard. For her, sort of money is the reality that we must all embrace. It's not in some ways because we live in a funding ecosystem, in some aspects, if you're lucky enough to get it at the moment. At times it can feel like, selling out to want to make money as your bottom line. But as Malu says, if you want to be abstract, the only people who can afford to do that already have money. It's such a like profound thing to be saying. It sort of feels like, pulling the veil back or something. But her real intention is to say, listen, not everything is going to tick all boxes. You're going to need to diversify your income streams. You need a mix of things. So perhaps as well as funding, we can think about something that's going to go ahead and make you a pile of cash so that then you can pursue the more abstract, pursue the more experimental works that, also make up a massive part of our craft. So, yeah, all these different points of tension, these binaries, these things that seem adversarial or in opposition, actually, everybody really wants the same thing, even though artists and organizations might seem to be on either side of the same coin. We all just want time to make work. We want space to fail safely. We want audiences who care, and we want work that lasts. So, I suppose it's just useful to kind of go, actually, we're all agreeing loudly. We all really want the same thing. It is just really difficult at the moment to really understand how we find our own sense of balance in something that feels precarious. That said, Dev here again with another lovely quote. We are the people who are self-empowered to fix stuff. That's basically our whole job. We're creatives, we're artists, we're technologists. Surely we can come up with something. And so this notion of dialogue feels really, really important. So yeah, as I say, the ecosystem is a stretched metaphor, but I will persevere because it really helps me to understand more of what's missing, like where the gaps are. So towards the end of this phase of the research, I really started to feel as if the ecosystem, the digital arts ecosystem is kind of extractive. It's this idea of competition, scarcity, it's not fully enmeshed with actually the reality, which is kind of one of interdependence. So, yeah, how can we design non-extractive systems? How can we encourage more biodiversity in the ecosystem that we all want to see? When we iterate really quickly and we kind of working at speed and we're doing all of our sprints, what are we losing along the way in terms of resilience or in terms of, an enriched soil that can be extremely fertile? Culture is not monoculture, etc. I think the thing that kept ringing in my mind as I navigated all of these topics was, I've now been working in the arts for, I guess about 15 years or so in like grown-up jobs, probably more like 20, 25 in non-grown-up jobs. And yeah, I've seen the difference 10 or 15 years ago to now. And so now I'm saying to myself, where do we want to be in 10 years? I don't want to be bleak, like we are trending in kind of predictable directions. Increasingly, the way that we talk about economics is also kind of interdependent. Um, you know, there's in the same way as you can't escape the nitrogen cycle, we also live in capitalism. How do we how do we see the wood for the trees? How do we name the thing? We need to generate new thoughts to think thoughts with. We know that art is improving health and community and well-being, but we're not always seeing necessarily a kind of complete cohesion between that tech innovation and some of the hoops that we feel like we perhaps need to jump through. So yeah, what can we invite in terms of a shift? This really nice kind of series of quotes from Sherry again here. The idea that institutional validity doesn't hold the same high currency value as before. You know, we're not living in the world of 10 years ago. We weren't living with all of the various millions of different technological advances that we're now seeing, and it's never been more possible to be extremely online or able to access your audience, you know. So yeah, I think it has to be a conversation. And that conversation needs to kind of comprehend, particularly now, you know, digital arts is now named as a real art form on the Arts Council in the Arts Council matrix. So this is like clearly a time rife with opportunity to kind of really define the kind of art form that we want to be. And the most recent, the most recent development with Arts Council also being the Hodge Report, you know, people talking about everything from reinvesting profits to other models that can work where the resource, you know, the money that's available in the system isn't, you know, there's no hint of it growing. There's no likelihood of it increasing. Sherry had another quote that also brings in my mind when I think about this, which is this notion that you need a trusted entity that can talk money, that can protect artists and guide work into the world. And I think, you know, I think that's also why I'm excited to be here this evening. I think the work that IDA's doing, as well as the work that Collusion's doing, you know, some of the other funding bodies and organizations around the country, like there is a real wish to kind of dive into cross-pollination and open up pathways and increase access, particularly where unwittingly doors are feeling closed. So a different set of questions. These are things that we might keep in mind as we kind of go through the remainder of the time that we've got together. And yeah, notionally, I'll kind of leave us on this idea of stewardship over extraction. You know, there's lots of different models for how we make work. We are navigating an extremely complex system, but looking at sort of better translation across models, financial or otherwise, clearer pathways, how to get there, shared risk, thinking about who sits with what risk and then the impact that has on accessibility. And intermediaries who can kind of bridge art, tech, money, and care. Yeah, it's an ongoing conversation, and whilst it's something that we aren't necessarily always able to escape or feel like we can really think outside of when we're in the weeds, you know, we can definitely think about our contribution and how we want our contribution to feed into this cycle, this system, which ultimately is really all about exchange. So yeah, I'm going to sort of stop sharing there so that we've got a good amount of time for questions if we'd like them. If we get into it, there's a diagram that I've been sort of tinkering with where I'm trying to figure out what happens when we don't have a full system that feeds back in on itself, which, yeah, I'll just sort of very quickly tease. So we might hop into it, but if there's not time, then I can probably share that with the report at a later date. But yeah, thank you so much for listening. Would be really interested to hear how that landed with anyone.